You know, I was struck this morning's session by something that Senator Pete Domenici of New Mexico was always very fond of saying in New Mexico. Mi casa es su casa, and mi agua es mi agua. And as water demands continue to grow here in Texas, we will be routinely challenged by managing our water resources to support a variety of different sectors: the municipality sector, agriculture, oil and gas, power generation, manufacturing, and we will be challenged to preserve our aquatic ecosystems. This morning, I feel fortunate that we put together an interesting panel and a number of panelists, each of whom have responsibilities for interacting with these various sectors, and each of whom have responsibility for managing and planning water resources across the state. And in the spirit of what I will call speed dating for panelist members, I'd like to provide very brief introductions for each in the order in which they'll actually speak this morning. Dr. Todd Bottler is the Executive Manager of Science, Intergovernmental Relations and Policy for the Guadalupe Blanco River Authority. Todd also is the current chair of the Texas Land Trust Council and editor-in-chief of the Texas Water Journal. Mr. Ron Ellis is manager of the Water Rights Permitting and Availability section of Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, where he manages major water use permit applications across the state of Texas. Karen Bondi is the manager of the Lower Colorado River Authority's Water Resource Management Department, where she directs a number of activities impacting Central Texas, including planning for LCRA's water supply for the current and future time. Drew Nelson is the Chief Energy Project Manager, Clean Energy Project Manager at the Environmental Defense Fund, where he spends a considerable amount of his time interacting on issues associated with natural gas drilling from shales and interacting with understanding the impacts of this drilling on communities across Texas and elsewhere. And Cindy Loeffler, who works on the Water Resources Branch Chief at Texas Parks and Wildlife, where she manages the water quality and water quantity programs and coordinates the department's response to resource issues affecting both fish and wildlife. And with those brief introductions, let me begin with Dr. Todd Bottler and thank each of the panelists for their participation.
You saw some scary slides this morning. I'm going to show you some more scary slides. So to keep up with that theme, I'm going to talk a little bit about past droughts and about our current water situation to kind of set up some of the topics that the other panel members are going to discuss. The GBRA was involved with a treeing study, and instead of going into all the details of the study, I'm just going to tell you that you can find it at the Texas Water Journal, where you can download it for free. And, you know, just to skip ahead here a little bit, you can see that projects like this are a lot of fun. But you can also see that it requires a grad student. That's you know, that's this guy up here. And so when you get to be my age, they don't expect you to climb up the tree. This is the result, and it's a reconstruction of the drought cycle in this climate division, Division 7, which includes Austin, San Antonio, and Corpus Christi. And we have similar reconstructions for the Trans-Pecos and for the area around Houston and the rest of South Texas. We don't have North Texas in this study. But what I want to talk to you about to begin here is the drought of record. Now I'm going to point the drought of record out to you and then tell you a little bit about it. Here it is right here. Anything below this line is deeper that line goes tells you the more severe the drought, and the wider it is, the longer term the drought. Now, in that drought, to put it in some context, there's some people here who lived through the drought, but most of us probably did not. If you think about the drought last year, and then take that drought and then precede it by 6 dry years or 9 dry years, depending on where you were in the state, that's really the drought of record. And so it's kind of difficult to imagine today having not lived through something like that. But as you can see, as you look back from 2010 to 1500, you can see similar droughts, and actually you see droughts that were worse. I mean, they lasted longer and they were deeper. And I just direct you to the time around the 1820s to about 1860. Then it's 30 years or so off and on of drought. And if you look at the time around 1700, really 1695 to about 1720, that's, at least in this area, was the worst of the droughts we could identify going back 500 years, more severe and longer lasting than the drought of record. So, this slide, which is some reason upside down, and will make its interpretation much more difficult. But I'm gonna have to detach the mic here if I can and try to get a little bit closer to it to tell you what this shows, because it's pretty important graph, and it's something you've heard quite a bit about today. Here we go. These are the years, and they're supposed to be down here, but they're not for some reason. And you can see this line indicating 1953. Now, that's in the beginning of the drought of record. And you can see this dashed line. Well, this is the amount of surface water per acre available in the state. And we are right here in the early 50s at the same position we are today. This peak is the surplus created out of the drought of record. In other words, the state went through the drought of record and started the water planning process and built a lot of surface water reservoirs and created this cushion, which peaked here in the early 70s and is now gone. So that's the surface water cushion which was created out of the experience of the drought of record, and it no longer exists. Okay. And of course, this one is also cattywampus, but I can tell you what this means as well. The green line is population. Here we are today, 25 million. During the drought of record here in the 1950s, we're at about 8 million. And the blue line is the surface water supply. And you can see, before the drought of record here, the blue line is below the population line. And then after the drought of record, when we're building these reservoirs, the blue line goes above the population line. Well, that's no longer the case anymore. It's substantially below that line. And here again, that is just another way of interpreting the lack of water supply development, particularly with regard to surface water, over the last couple of decades. Okay, well, here's one that's right side up. This shows the drawdown in aquifers in the state since 1900 or before to present. You can see here in some places that you have more than 800 feet of drawdown over that period. Other areas up like the Ogallala, you can see only about 200 feet, but all aquifers are different, and so that 200-foot drawdown in the Ogallala means quite a bit more than it might indicate just by looking at the colors in the map here. But you also see, places like, here's the Edwards Aquifer. You don't really see much change. Well, unlike these other aquifers, the Edwards Aquifer can be depleted extremely rapidly, but you can also fill up very rapidly. And case in point, from end of March until the beginning of May, the Edwards Aquifer fell 20 feet, and then we had a couple of rain events, and it went up 17 feet. So we were looking at a really bad summer as of a couple of weeks ago for the Edwards Aquifer, and then that changed very quickly. So just a couple of final thoughts. Talking about, Ron Kaiser was talking about errors having to do with water. I kind of think of it along this line. From 1900 to about 1980, that's really the era of water supply development. Since that time, we're really in the era of water reallocation, which means reallocation of water primarily from agriculture to municipal and industrial uses. Now, you've also heard about the water planning process. In 97, after that, the drought in 96, the state creates the new kind of bottoms-up water planning process, and it also does some other things like puts in the prohibition on interbasin transfers or the restrictions on them. And it does not do one major thing that we still have not done, and that is create a financing mechanism for our water projects. And it's something that continues to trouble us today. And as you heard Robert Puente say, the prospects of doing something about that are probably not that good now, this next legislative session, because it's starting to rain. We can all hope that that's not the case. We used to get a lot of money from the federal government for water projects. We don't anymore. And I can tell you, I mean, beyond what we all know about the current fiscal situation, the key subcommittee in Congress and the House is the House Water and Power Subcommittee. There are 19 members. 5 are from California, including the chairman. Texas has 1, and his district is along the Texas-Louisiana border. So his constituents have a very different point of view about water development in the state, and so that gives you a little indication of how likely we are to get federal help in terms of financing new water projects. And then the final thought is that droughts similar or worse than the drought of record are on the horizon someplace. Maybe some of us will experience a drought like that, maybe we won't, but certainly we will have future droughts of that nature. And that's all I have. Easier just to hand it to you.
You're going to make me put it back on. Okay, that should work. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about TCEQ's drought activities in 2011, specifically in relation to public water systems. I'll cover a little bit of everything, but the public water systems is kind of the emphasis. But first, this particular slide shows a comparison of the October 4th Texas or U.S. drought monitor map for the state of Texas. That was, hello? It was near the peak of the drought of 2011 as far as the drought monitor is concerned. And then that compares it to the May 8th drought monitor, which is one of the more recent maps. In October of 2011, 88% of the state was classified as being an exceptional drought, and on May 8th, only about 7% was considered to be an exceptional drought. Things have improved some as far as the drought monitor is concerned. This particular map, I believe Dr. Maidment showed a similar map earlier. It shows the public water systems and what sort of drought restrictions that they're presently under. TCEQ provides targeted outreach and assistance to public water systems. This information is self-reported by the systems to TCEQ, and we try to remain in contact and encourage them all to update the status of their drought restrictions at any given time. We've established guidance for these systems on emergency interconnections, emergency use of wells for drinking water, and we provide lists of companies that can haul drinking water. We closely monitor the status of these systems. They can update their status through our webpage, or they can call us. We try to keep an eye on them just to make sure to know what their status is. Currently, there's 1,006 water systems that are asking customers to follow outdoor water use restrictions. Of those systems, 596 are asking customers to follow a mandatory watering schedule, and 26 are prohibiting all outdoor watering. 410 systems are asking customers to follow a voluntary system. Now, there's a group of water systems that we try to watch very closely. These are systems that, according to their self-reporting, may have less than 180 days water supply remaining. We intensively monitor this list of systems. We've offered these systems financial, managerial, and technical assistance. It includes identification of alternative sources, coordination of emergency drinking water planning, and identification of possible funding sources to try to resolve their problems. We've worked with several public water suppliers to identify and resolve system problems. We've seen intakes that have gone dry due to dropping reservoir levels. We've seen wells that have stopped producing due to mechanical problems with pumps or due to dropping aquifer levels. To try to help mitigate the effects on these systems, we've partnered with the Texas Division of Emergency Management, the Texas Water Development Board, and the Texas Department of Agriculture to support these local jurisdictions' efforts to secure a reliable source of drinking water supply. Recently, the TCEQ sponsored 7 drought outreach workshops around the state. We had workshops in Nacogdoches, Kerrville, New Braunfels, Liberty, Midland, San Angelo, and Lubbock. We also have one coming up in Brownsville. These emergency planning workshops provide local government officials and system operators information to try to help prevent or mitigate outages. This slide shows a screenshot of our drought webpage. The TCEQ drought webpage is kind of a clearinghouse for information for public water systems, information about TCEQ drought response. Some of the information on here is information about priority calls that were made during the 2011 drought. In 2011, the TCEQ responded to 15 priority calls around the state. They were in the Brazos, Guadalupe, Colorado, Sabine, and Neches River basins. We received priority calls from municipal, industrial, irrigation, domestic, and livestock water rights. All total, these calls resulted in suspension or curtailment of over 1,200 water rights. Additionally, TCEQ stopped issuing temporary water use permits in the basins that were affected by priority calls. So one thing to note is suspended water rights did not include water rights for municipal use or for power generation due to concerns about public health and safety. Due to improved conditions around the state, all of these senior calls have been lifted at this time, but we have warned junior water right holders that, should conditions get worse again and should additional priority calls be made, then additional suspensions might be necessary. That's all I've got. I'll be glad to answer any questions when we're done. Thanks.
Good afternoon. Oh, still morning. Good morning. My name's Karen Bondi. I'm with the Lower Colorado River Authority, and we manage about 600 miles of the Texas-Colorado River. As seen on this map, the light blue area is the watershed of the lower Colorado River. To manage future water demands and ensure that the supplies will be available to meet those demands, LCRA developed a water supply resource plan that projects demands and supplies to the end of the century. And not surprising, for the next 90 years, the increases in demands are mainly due to population growth. This slide gives you a pretty good idea of where those demands are. The darker blue bars represent the demands from 2011, the actual demands for what we call firm water use, which is mostly municipal and industrial. The red bars represent the projected 2060 firm demand, and the green represents 2100 demands. Now the lighter blue bars, which you'll primarily see on the right of the graph, that was the actual 2011 agricultural demands. Now it's not clear yet whether ag demands are going to decline. They may decline, but they've actually increased since about 10 years ago. And primarily in our river, the biggest ag use is rice irrigation. So looking forward, the sectors at risk are primarily agricultural demand. As firm demands increase, the Highland Lakes water will become less available for water for agriculture. Now, LCRA provides two different types of water supply to our customers. Firm demand, firm water is for water that would be available even through a repeat of the drought of record. And so industries, power plants, other types of industries, and municipalities typically need that type of water. Well, agriculture most of the agriculture in our basin uses interruptible demand. Then they pay a much lower price for it, which makes it affordable for their business. But when water is less available, like during the 2011 drought, their water supply gets reduced. And so this year, for the first time, LCRA is not supplying water to most of that agricultural sector. So what are we doing about that? Well, LCRA has been a leader in water conservation for decades, primarily in the area of agricultural conservation, but we also are making great strides in firm water conservation as well for industry and municipalities. We're updating our water management plan, which is a plan that allocates water between the various uses like municipal, industrial, agriculture, environment, to reflect these growing demands and the impact on available for interruptible water supply. But even with efficient management and aggressive water conservation, our board of directors realized that more water supply is needed and recently passed a resolution declaring that we will develop about 100,000 acre-feet of new firm water supply in the next 5 years. Now, just for reference, an acre-foot is about as much water as a football field 1 foot deep, or about 325,000 gallons. But we look at water in terms of acre-feet. And all options are on the table for this new water supply. Reservoirs, aquifer storage and recovery, desalination, groundwater, we're looking at all of these options. For example, we recently started testing gravel pits, abandoned gravel pits in the lower basin to see if we can store water there. And just last week, our board approved LCRA applying for permits to develop about 10,000 acre-feet of groundwater in Bastrop County for a demand we have there for our power plant. And that is all I had to say about water demands and sectors at risk, and I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Drew Nelson. I'm with the Environmental Defense Fund, and I'm a bit of an outlier here today because I'm not a water person. I'm an energy person, and the links between energy and water are significant and getting even more significant. There's the obvious ones, like we heard this morning about power supply being very dependent upon water supply, but there's also kind of the less obvious ones, which I'll get to here through the course of my talk here, and that's natural gas drilling and water demand. So bear with me for half a second while I talk about natural gas, then we'll talk about water. So clearly there's significant benefits to the increased natural gas boom that we're seeing in the US, particularly the shale gas boom. But there's also a number of significant risks that are coming with that. And so what we're trying to do at the Environmental Defense Fund, we're one of the only nationwide organizations that's actually saying natural gas can be a good thing for the US if it's done correctly. We're trying to minimize these risks. And for this particular audience, for this particular conversation, the risk of water demand and water usage is a very significant one. And one thing that I've taken away from the conversation this morning is that with the stressors of climate change and increased population, the margin for error that we have in our water usage here in Texas is small and getting ever smaller. And what we're doing essentially right now is we're taking billions of gallons of water and flushing it down the proverbial toilet for natural gas drilling. And that has a benefit to it, which is the economics of natural gas drilling, but there's also a significant risk. And so according to the drought monitor from last week, there's drought-like conditions in a significant part of Texas. 100% of the Eagle Ford, which is one of the biggest natural gas plays in Texas, lots of oil drilling, is in drought-like conditions. That's the same for the Haynesville, which is the Texas-Louisiana border, 50%, 45% of Barnett, which is in the DFW area. And when you're drilling for natural gas and you're using hydraulic fracturing, you are using significant amounts of water, and we've heard that water demand in Texas is already outpacing supply. So in the Eagle Ford, you're using about 6.1 million gallons per well. And if you figured out how much water that is for each of the wells that were permitted last year, permitted, not necessarily drilled, that gives you about 17.2 billion gallons, and do that in all the other major gas plays in Texas, and that gives you about 30.8 billion gallons. I don't know how much that is in acre feet. I'll let someone smarter than I figure that out. And that doesn't include the Permian Basin, which is undergoing a significant rejuvenation because of fracturing and the oil drilling that's happening there. The Permian is pretty close to Midland, Odessa, and we heard earlier today just how desperate it is in the water situation in the Permian Basin and Midland, Odessa. So we're using a ton of water, well, more than a ton, I guess, but a significant amount of water, and that's only going to go up. There's projected to be 25,000 wells in the Eagle Ford over the next 20 years. And when you're using that water, in the vast majority of cases, you're completely removing it from the hydraulic system. It doesn't evaporate. It doesn't go down into the aquifers. It gets deep water injected, and it stays there for millions of years, or that's the hope at least. And so what does it mean to the public? Well, I think that picture pretty much sums it up. We've gotten lots of calls from people saying that my neighbor started drilling on his land and my water level fell 15 feet. Now, this was last summer, so how much of that is, I don't think it was 15 feet, actually. I think it was 10 feet. Sorry to over-exaggerate there. But how much of that is because of the hydraulic fracturing on his neighbor's property? How much of that was because of the drought? I certainly can't tell you. I don't think anyone in this room could probably tell you. But the fact of the matter remains that the perception is there that increased hydraulic fracturing is causing a significant drawdown of water supplies, particularly in areas where there's already a significant stress of drought and climate change and population. So what I think you're going to see is you're going to see the new kid on the block, which is hydraulic fracturing, be subjected to a lot of extra scrutiny by the local residents because that's water hasn't traditionally been used for hydraulic fracturing. And so it's easy to say, oh yeah, well we're used to using it for this, and this. We've done that for 100 years, but we're not used to seeing it for hydraulic fracturing. So until the oil and gas industry is going to find a way, and they are working on it by the way, but until the oil and gas industry finds a way to stop using as much water and to stop using potable water to do the hydraulic fracturing, they're going to have a pretty big target on their backs. But the good news is that there's a significant amount of things that can be done. But right now, we're still in the panic and run away phase of the hydraulic fracturing process. But you can use brackish water instead of potable water. Doing that will significantly decrease the amount of pressure that hydraulic fracturing causes on the potable water supply. You can use increased water recycling. So for the water that you're using to fracture a well, a lot of it stays down, but a lot of it comes back up. You can then capture that water and use it for the next well. That's being done more and more, and that's also taking a lot of the demand that the hydraulic fracturing and natural gas drilling is putting on the water supply. There's also a lot of interesting work that's being done about reusing the produced and flowback water instead of injecting it into deep water wells. There was a paper that came out not too long ago from Texas A&M that proposed that if you take a desalinization plant, with the desalinization plant, you've got the good water, and then you've got the concentrated icky stuff, which I believe is a technical term. You can then sell that concentrated water to the oil and gas industry, and they can use that to hydraulically fracture the wells. And by doing so, you are significantly decreasing the payback period for a desalinization plant because you've got two revenue streams, the water that you're producing as well as the water that you would have to have paid to dispose of otherwise. Now, I don't know in terms of the geology of different formations here in Texas in terms of whether or not that water, because it's so concentrated and so salty, will have damage on the well casings and the well pipes. And there's probably some economic cost to that need to be looked at. But if that's true, and you can really significantly accelerate the payback period for a desalinization plant, then we heard earlier that more and more areas are going to be looking at desalinization for water demand. Well, that corresponds with the Permian, that corresponds with the Eagle Ford. Here's a pretty easy way in which you can boost demand and increase the economics of it. So I think as the industry starts to do more and more of these things, we'll transition from the panic and run away. Oh yeah, there's always the increased need for data collection, which I think most people in this room will agree with. But as we start to implement more and more of these things, we move away from panic and run away and towards keep calm and carry on. So thank you very much.
Okay, good morning. I won't have time to talk about the wildfires that plagued Texas last year, but the background slide there is Bastrop State Park. Looking a lot better these days, but that was what it looked like last year. So quickly, you heard a little bit of this from Ron Kaiser. Texas is pretty blessed in terms of the water resources, freshwater, and our bays and estuaries. Also in terms of the number of species of fish. We have over 250 species of fish, and 150 of those are native freshwater fish found in Texas. So what that means is that we're one of the most biologically diverse states in the nation. Also important in terms of the economic impact of the anglers that like to come to Texas and fish and leave their money. Studies that we have show that sportsmen together, so hunters and anglers and wildlife viewers, spend over $6 billion in Texas. So kind of important to take care of that. And a recent poll that was done, 91% of people that we talked to indicated that protecting states' water resources is very important. But there are threats to these aquatic ecosystems. At least 5 of our native Texas freshwater fishes are extinct now, no longer found anywhere, and 3 are no longer found in Texas. And bad news doesn't end there, that we also have around 20% of the remaining Texas native fishes that are threatened in Texas. And list we don't like being on is with 31 or so aquatic species on a threatened or endangered list, federally listed. We're in the top 5 or bottom 5 states in terms of these species listings. So one of the things that's important for protecting our native aquatic ecosystems, kind of makes sense, fish need water, is environmental flows. Spent a lot of my time working on this issue, and really in a nutshell what we're talking about with environmental flows are the water left remaining in the rivers and streams, allowed to flow to the bays and estuaries. Spring flows that emanate from our aquifers also make up part of the environmental flow picture. provide a number of services, of course, habitat for fish and wildlife, but also help protect water quality, provide recreational opportunities, navigation, just that intrinsic value of having flowing rivers and streams in our state. You know, kind of playing on this theme of different eras of water in Texas, you know, you've heard a bit this morning about Senate Bill 1, Senate Bill 2, Senate Bill 3. Those are the more recent major water legislation packages that have passed through the legislature. Back in the 1980s, there was also legislation that led to what we call kind of the era when fish and wildlife became considered. You know, before the 1980s, when most of the permits were granted, there were not considerations for fish and wildlife back then. You know, I think probably the thought was there was plenty of water for everybody, plenty of water for fish and wildlife, just really wasn't considered. So post-1985 would be the era when we really started tackling some of these issues. You know, the good news is I think Texas has a good framework in place. We've made incremental progress, but there's still a lot to be done on this issue, and I think Todd touched on this. You know, it's really going to come down to, you know, as TCEQ goes through this process with Senate Bill 3, the environmental flow setting, standard setting process, we don't have water to meet those standards everywhere in the state. So how will those standards be met in the future? So shift gears a bit and talk about you know, what the 2011 drought meant from a fish and wildlife perspective. And so this is one of our rivers last summer with a cow meandering across. You know, normally this would be a flowing river full of fish and other critters. You've seen plenty of scary drought maps, but I don't think you've seen this one. So Texas Water Development Board, relying on USGS data, but looking at it from a stream flow perspective. So the red and the orange show, you know, areas of the state as of last September that had less than 10th percentile, 5th percentile type flows. So, you know, looking at something like this on a statewide basis was really an eye-opener. Definitely had our attention. You know, I was, you know, kind of doing a few interviews last summer and talking about when you get to a point where fish and wildlife are impacted by a drought, you know you're in a serious drought, and we definitely saw that last summer. Just going to touch on a few quick examples of some of the work that the department did with others to address some of these impacts to fish and wildlife. Here's the Brazos River, upper reaches of the Brazos River, biologists from Parks and Wildlife and Texas Tech University rescuing rare shiner species of fish. They actually had to go and physically remove the fish from the river because it was drying up and take them, place them in a state fish hatchery. Still not out of the woods in that these fish need to have spawning pulses in the springtime for them to be able to continue their life cycle. And the word is if they don't get that spawning cue this spring, then this could be lights out for the species. So we're hoping they get their spawning cue. A spring flow example, the Edwards Aquifer, you heard Robert Puente talking about this morning, and Todd. You know, there we have a number of federally endangered species that depend upon the spring flow at San Marcos and Comal. It's been a productive stakeholder process, again, through Senate Bill 3 that has led to what we think will be lasting solutions to help protect minimum spring flows in these systems. But this graph is from last summer showing just how scary low the flows in the San Marcos River were getting you know, towards the late fall. Fortunately, things have improved somewhat. Still a bit concerned about, you know, what the future could hold, drought going forward with the pumping demands on the Edwards. And this is what those reservoirs west of the 100th meridian that Ron Kaiser was talking about, what they look like, or looked like last summer from a fish perspective. So when you have conditions like we had last summer, fish kills happen. You know, one, if you don't have water, then there's an obvious causal effect there, but also when you start getting into low DO, low dissolved oxygen, high temperatures, that can cause fish kills. And what we saw a lot of last summer were harmful algae blooms. So the picture over on the right was the reservoir that was blood red last summer, and that was due to algae problem. With our bays and estuaries along the coast, you start having decreased freshwater inflows that lead to high salinity conditions. Normally the bays are where the freshwater from inland water bodies mixes with the saltwater from the Gulf, and we have salinity gradients in these bay systems that are unique for producing a lot of the seafood that we enjoy come from these bay systems and other species. What we saw happening last summer, again, red tide along the Texas coast that virtually shut down the commercial oyster season along the entire Texas coast. Happily, that situation has improved with the rainfall. Commercial oyster season was reopened before the end of the year, but it was, again, an economic impact that came from the drought conditions and the reduced environmental flows to our bays and estuaries. And with that, I think I will sit down before he flashes that sign at me.